Okay, everybody. We do have about 50 people registered for today, but a lot of people register and then get rid of the recordings after. So I think we're going to get started because we have a lot to go through. Thank you so much for coming today. Today's workshop is crisis communications. So we're going to talk about the essentials to building a plan. We do have a full day workshop on this for our clients that we go through, where we choose 5 to 10 different scenarios and we build out the all of the different processes and the press releases and holding statements for each of those scenarios specific to our clients. But today we're just going to do a general overview and talk probably about a few case studies along the way. We open all of our presentations with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges the Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy. That includes Siksika, Kainai, Bikani, as well as the Ayarhe, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Okay, so some of you, I recognize your names coming in. Thank you for coming. And some of you are new to Alchemy Communications. So I'll just give a little bit of an overview on what we do. We are a communications, full service communications agency. So we specialize in public relations and marketing. And we also do quite a bit of crisis communications. So we're a small but mighty team of 15, and we're based in Calgary, but we do work across North America. And we do have some clients in the UK at this time as well. So my primary area of expertise, I am the CEO of the company and the founder of the company, is crisis communications. And so that's definitely the area I work and play in. We work, half of our business at any given time is nonprofit or municipal work. And then the other portion goes to small businesses. And that typically is in the $5 million to $10 million in revenue per year. So not too small. I hate to call those guys small business because that's starting to feel pretty big. When we talk about crisis communications, I think we all, knowing who's on the registered for this workshop today, I think we all know what we're talking about here. But we're really looking at today unpredictable events that erode an organization's public trust. And so that can be anything to do with reputational damage or something that might threaten the existence of the organization or the viability of the organization to the future. I'm just going to keep letting people in as they arrive here. So sometimes that's a positive thing where PR works in your favor to build trust. And sometimes it, as we all know, it goes the opposite direction. So today we're going to be talking about that opposite direction. So we see things like data breaches on a regular basis. Unfortunately, right now, we just saw one a few months ago that was an app developer that developed an app that allowed people to input their vaccine passports and then get into large stadiums. So in our city, that was for our Saddle Dome to go to the Calgary Flames games. And someone hacked into that software and created a data breach of healthcare information because your vaccine passport would be considered protected information. And then they went to CBC, our Canadian Broadcast Corporation, which is our public media, publicly funded media in Canada for our international folks on the call today. And so they took it very seriously and were quite aggressive about sharing that story. And so bringing that client around to build back trust was quite challenging. We like to have our clients prepped before those kinds of things happen. When we get calls in the midst of the crisis, it's quite challenging to bring it around. We unfortunately now prepare most of our clients, especially our post-secondary schools, for active shooter type of situations. Our hospitals are the same kind of thing, or anybody in a high risk situation. So our municipalities, our larger municipalities, our smaller ones too, actually, even our town halls are having more threats of violence than ever before. Resident petitions, we manage quite a few different resident petitions and public engagement, community surveys, feasibility studies, those kinds of things. And then certainly cancel culture or cancellations of people based on what they've said is very common nowadays and can be quite damaging to organizations and to individuals in their future careers. So we do spend quite a bit of time on that as well. So obviously with the prevalence of social media and our increased reliance on our digital tools and staying connected during the pandemic, crisis comms has become more complex, and those crises have definitely become more frequent, and we're seeing people more activated on social media and on digital tools in order to share content. I'm just going to make sure that we're all muted here so that I don't get any background noise, but if you have any questions, feel free to just go ahead and post them in that chat tool, and I'll address them. So the rise of cancel culture. So what we're talking about with cancel culture is the popular practice of withdrawing support. Really started in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in the United States. We really saw it. And you can see on this graph of Google Trends how it really skyrocketed. So that term skyrocketed, but the practice definitely has always been there. We've always had angry mobs, that's for sure. We're just seeing it digitally now, and we're seeing more people more activated in calling for resignations, damaging reputation, ending organizations, that's for sure. So cancel culture refers, like I said, to that popular practice of withdrawing support or canceling public figures or companies after they've done or said something that people find objectionable or offensive. We're generally talking about social media when we're talking about cancel culture here. It's really the group shaming tool that we're looking at. The roots were definitely in the Me Too movement, but they've definitely evolved from there. So what we're looking at with this kind of thing is holding people accountable that were previously immune to any kind of consequence. And sometimes it's a good thing. Like when we look at the Harvey Weinstein situation, that person deserved to have consequences for his behavior. A court of law found him guilty and has punished him, but that started as a result of a cancel culture activity or the Me Too movement. The pandemic has only increased this cultural impact and the power of the internet. And so I'm sure you all have some examples, I would assume, and I'm always interested to hear those if you want to share them. But the challenge on cancel culture is the criteria is an absolutely moving target. So supporters argue that cancel culture is an important tool in holding people accountable, achieving social justice, giving a voice to those who've been historically shut out. But critics argue that it limits open debate and the free exchange of ideas. And I think we've all felt that, in today's culture, you have to be cautious about what you say. And you wouldn't want to offend anybody, and you certainly wouldn't want to be held accountable for something you've said as a mistake, or you misspoke or said something in jest that maybe wasn't appreciated. So it's really hard to define or get the exact definition of what's unacceptable or problematic and offensive. And it changes from region to region, from community to community, and from individual group. That has a common ground to other individual groups. So there's such a wide spectrum of opinions and values and ideologies. So this is a very quickly evolving field. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of research into it because it's quite new from the communications sector. We're just starting to study it and talk about it in the university post-secondary kind of field. But a lot of those in communications, and I think we have quite a few comms people on today, are working through this as we speak. So there's no time to just sit back and study what to do in these situations. We have to live and work through them. So it can be quite challenging. We really are seeing a weaponization of social media more than ever before. And it's unfortunate because we've used social media to rapidly disseminate information, to mobilize people or groups towards certain beliefs and actions. We've seen that currently with the Ukrainian war with Russia. And social media has definitely activated those people into protecting their sovereignty. And so there's definitely benefits of it. But social media plays on emotions and biases. And as we've seen, things can go viral that you may not want to go viral. It can have you can have positive or nefarious intentions and real world consequences. Fake news is so significant right now, and we've seen that a Canadian sniper that's in the Ukraine, the Russian media recently put out posts saying that he had been killed in combat, and so he was getting a number of calls from his friends and family checking on him, and of course he was still alive. Luckily, he was still alive. So that fake news component that's being shared and playing on people's emotions is quite significant, and we all have to be cautious of it. Social media is a weapon when it's used with those nefarious intentions. So we see that boycotting or canceling a complete organization or an individual, especially in, I know we've got a few municipalities on today. We see a lot of that with mayors, councils, reeves, that kind of thing. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So misinformation is, this is the information I have. It's incorrect, but it's the information I have and I believe it to be true. Disinformation is sharing incorrect information and calling it correct. It's a much more nefarious type of activity, and we see this so commonly, especially in our municipal with our municipal clients on particularly high conflict type of issues. And they run rampant on social media. And for smaller municipalities, it's very difficult for them to manage these kinds of campaigns because they don't have the capacity to constantly be monitoring all kinds of different social media platforms, let alone responding. And then the person responding is often facing quite a large amount of pushback that feels like bullying and looks like bullying and is bullying. And in a small community, everybody knows everybody. So it's quite significant for the staff members managing this. Just see someone else coming in here, so I'm just going to let them in. And then certainly radicalization and recruitment, we've seen this as well. So during the pandemic, we certainly saw this around any kind of vaccine debate, as well as we've seen it with different high conflict type situations with Syria and recruitment of, and smaller too, I shouldn't say smaller, but recruitment around things like protests in the city of, around the cities of Alberta and towns of Alberta. And then certainly the white supremacist movement across North America right now with the active shooting situations that we've seen in the United States over the last weekend. So we can trace a lot of this back to social media. We can trace it back to media being shared on social media. And so there's real world consequences that a lot of organizations, municipalities need to be prepared for. And like I said, we never want to have a client call. We do quite often get clients calling us in the moment of a crisis, but that's very challenging to manage because our clients are then in the height of a very stressful situation, and to mobilize stakeholders to make decisions quickly can be quite challenging. So that's why we really encourage our clients to have a crisis comms plan in place. Everybody has the potential to become a media source, and everybody has the potential of having a crisis surrounding them happen. So we really see the speed of digital and social media not allowing for time to think or time to create messaging structures or press releases or speeches to respond. You really have to get ahead of those narratives, get ahead of those stories and tell your story and own that narrative first. Because if you don't, someone else will. And I guarantee you it won't be the narrative that you appreciate. So we really encourage our clients to sit down and think about what are the top 5 or 10 crises that you might face. So it might be a data breach. If you're a nonprofit, it might be one of the clients that you serve being injured on site. We've even had situations where a murder happened on the site of a client, their office buildings. It had nothing to do with the client, but they were connected to it just by virtue of that's the location that that crime happened. And so you have to think about where those things happen and how you're going to respond. Like I said, everybody is prone to this risk now, so you have to really have a plan in place. So you need to be able to respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is almost impossible for our small municipal clients or our small nonprofits to do. But having a plan in place and understanding your messaging structure and how to move through it is really going to make a big difference in how well you survive those crises. You can't control every aspect of a crisis, obviously, but you can manage your message and the groundwork you've laid to be prepared. So if, for example, you're the CAO of a municipality and you know that you're in a high flood zone or a high risk flood zone, you know that, and I'm sure you would have an operational flood readiness plan or flood response plan, but you should have a communications plan as well. Or if you have a fire and you need to communicate, you would have those crises operational plans. And a lot of times the communication component isn't in place. Or you might be facing a protest. So we saw this last summer and the summer before and throughout the year, actually. But Black Lives Matter movements and protests that arose as a result of that movement. In our small municipalities in Western Canada, they really struggled with how to address those topics in an appropriate manner. And so we saw a lot of mayors and councillors and reeves speaking on the topic without a lot of research into the issue and the history behind the movement and how it affects their community. And so in an effort to address the issue, it sometimes didn't play as well as they'd hoped it to. So you have to think about all of those different aspects and at least have a framework for how you're going to handle them. So for us, when we do a crisis comms plan, we do create that list of potential crises. We create sample statements, so holding statements. So we've been made aware that this issue has come up and we're looking into it and we'll get back to you quickly, or a full press release or a full statement in response to something. It's really important to have your roles and responsibilities regarding communications very clearly laid out. And this is where, again, we see a lot of our clients having operational plans, but not communication strategies. So if you have a comms person in place, but it's only one person and you might have a crisis that's ongoing for days and days, you need to be able to have a way for that person to take a break. You also need to have an approval process. You need to, if they're not very senior in their role without a lot of experience, they'll need to have some training on how to manage this kind of responsibility and who they have for support. But you have to have the processes and protocols on what constitutes a crisis, when to respond, what the timing is, who the stakeholders are that need to be messaged to first. And every stakeholder group needs a different structure to their message. And that's some training that needs to happen that we often see is missed. For example, if you have a university, your board of directors would have a different message than your students would have. And that would be different than the media would have. They would all have there'd be a different angle. And I'm sure you can imagine in an active shooter situation, you're going to address the board with what you're doing to protect the school, as well as to protect the organization as a whole into the future. For students, you need to address their safety concerns immediately, how to, first responders would need to have a different message communicated versus stakeholders and donors. So, and then general media. So there's lots of different stakeholder groups that would need different messaging. And if you only have 15 minutes or 30 minutes to get out a message, and you have a number of approvals to go through, you can see how you need to have a plan, because the stress really rises in these situations, and it's difficult for people to make those choices quickly when they don't have it laid out in front of them. And then media training is very important. So preparation and practice delivery of those messages is very important. If nobody has on your team has ever been a spokesperson before, if they've never done media training, that's something that you should definitely look at investing in. And there's lots of organizations that do it. We do it as well. And we offer them, we offer the 1 hour one for free on our regular workshops like this one. And then we do a full day one as well that's more specific to your organization. But media training is really significant, and you can see a number of people that have quite a few resources have still made mistakes when they're speaking to the media and have caused significant damage. When you think about Lac Mégantic and the tragedy that happened there with the train accident, for our international folks, that was a rail accident that caused a significant explosion in a very small town and killed over 80 people very quickly. The town did not have that large a population, so it was a terrible incident, one of the worst tragedies in Canadian history, especially rail history. The owner of that particular rail line, MM&R, was not prepared for the level of intensity of those journalists or the aggressiveness of those journalists. And so when you don't want to be figuring out what you're going to say or figuring out media training in the midst of a crisis when you're dealing with situations that need actionable steps from you in the moment. So you really need to assess your weaknesses in existing communications processes or handling, or you need to debrief past crisis scenarios and what you did well, what you didn't do well, and learn from them in order to go forward. And if you have any questions, feel free. We have a few too many. I think you could actually feel free to interrupt and ask a question if you like, or use that chat tool at the top, and I'll keep an eye on it. Like I said, I think we've got enough people that we can just kind of roll with it. A good crisis comms plan will disseminate critical information quickly. It will protect your stakeholders, their property potentially. It will demonstrate transparency. So our municipal clients especially get a lot of pushback from their residents if they're not transparent, or if they're viewed as not being transparent on a high conflict situation that's got a reputational risk to it. In a tragedy situation, we really have to prioritize victims and those impacted before anything else. So there's a certain structure to how we talk and how we speak to victims in certain situations. And so we're always looking at the community that is impacted first, then we're looking at staff or employees of your organization, and then we're looking at the environment. And that prioritizes who we speak to in terms of stakeholder groups first as well, and how we speak about them and to them. And we know from research that this prioritization is really important in order to recover effectively from these situations in the long run. So Maple Leaf Foods, for example, I'm using lots of Canadian examples. So I apologize for any of our folks outside of Canada, but Maple Leaf Foods is one of our largest meat processing. They process a lot of different foods, but in this case, it was packaged like a sandwich meat kind of situation. And they had a bacteria outbreak called Listeria, and a number of people died. I believe almost 20 died in a very short period of time. And they were very young people and very old people. And so in that case, our federal government issued a national press release. Maple Leaf Foods immediately contacted the CEO, Michael McCain, who's the McCain family in Canada is one of our wealthiest families and very well known. He contacted each of the families directly. He puts different supports in place, and then they went on to create a short video that went national, and I believe international actually, that took responsibility for it. So they already knew that they were responsible. So the same day that the federal government released the product recall, Maple Leaf Foods released a video of the CEO taking responsibility, and he had already spoken to the victims and the impacted families. This is so important when it comes to reputational management. And of course, when we're talking about tragedy like this, I hate to be talking about reputation, but these are companies that employ a lot of people, and Maple Leaf Foods has a long history in our country, so it was important. Disney is another example. The day that they were opening Shanghai Disney, was the day the accident happened, or not accident, the incident where an alligator attacked a 2-year-old in one of their outlying areas on property, but outside of the park. And so this was a family that was having a picnic, and in Florida, the low-lying areas have standing water, and there was an alligator in there, and it attacked this child. And as a result, the child did pass away. So the CEO at the time was Bob Iger, and he immediately spoke to the family, put resources in place, and then did international media taking responsibility. Now, you can't always take responsibility right out of the gate. Sometimes it's more complicated, and that's where having a prioritization of messaging is really important. So at the end of the day, a child died in that situation. That's the priority. The only thing that you're thinking about is supporting that family as they move through that process. And the investigation and what actually happened will happen, but in the moment, that's going to be what you focus on. And you really need to control the narrative. If you're not the person speaking, then someone else is going to speak for you. And I guarantee you won't be happy with what they're saying. So what is a narrative? The narrative is the story or thoughts that come into people's minds when your organization is mentioned. And so what you want to do is control that. You want to represent, you want to have a brand awareness for your organization or your town or your nonprofit that is positive. And so we want to think about how people experience or interact with you. They want to have a good customer experience or a good resident experience. We want to think about what others say about you in social media and traditional media, and then what you say about yourself. If a bad thing's happened, here are our values. This is our plan. We're putting victims and people first. This is a really important messaging structure, and I can't emphasize this enough. Our municipal clients are really challenged with this. I think sometimes the CAOs of our municipalities and our mayors, our reeves and our councillors, they're managing so many different issues. It's often difficult to have a really strong positive narrative about a council, especially when there's a more controversial project in place. We're representing a very large flood mitigation strategy right now that's quite controversial. And even though the mayor and council are trying to do what's best for the residents, it's not always smooth sailing. And so controlling that narrative, it's never one and done. You don't say one thing and then the narrative is established and then you can step away. You need to constantly be going back over and over again and talking to people in different ways. So traditional media, social media, town halls, for example, or email newsletters, all of those pieces help, and none of them are ever finished. And then we need to talk about making mistakes, which we all do. And especially with cancel culture right now, we make mistakes with the things we say. I work in this industry. I'm studying the language I'm supposed to be using all the time, and I still make mistakes. For example, we were on the periphery of a campaign in the UK and London. Their universities there have a very high incidence of sexual assault. And so they had a campaign around rape culture on campus, and that was the hashtag. And we did a lot of work around that. And then when we came to UBC and talked to UBC and did their media training, they said, we never use the word rape in this post-secondary university. It's not the language that we use. We use sexual violence against women. And so they were quite offended that I would use the word rape. And so it's very interesting. Regionally, you're going to see differences. Language, especially around race relations. So the BIPOC acronym is heavily used in the Western Prairie provinces in Canada. But when I went into Oregon and I used it there with municipalities, they said, "Oh, we don't ever use that language here anymore." So it's very different. And so you have to get really comfortable with making the effort to do right and then making an apology when you've made a mistake. So we really want to acknowledge impact. So over defending the mistake that you made or defending your reputation. So I am quick to say, I am really sorry if I offended anybody. That wasn't my intention. But obviously there was impact and harm. So I apologize, or something along those lines. There's no quick fix though. In those cases, the damage was relatively minor. I was able to recover from them, but probably because I acknowledged them right away, and we had an environment where people were comfortable sharing their experiences and talking about it. But there's on a bigger issue, we can see there's no quick fixes. So there's lots of examples, especially in politics, of politicians making mistakes. Our prime minister, for example, has made a number of mistakes in terms of offending people and apologizes for them on a regular basis. We see that happening pretty often. He's not as forgiven as he would hope, I'm sure. And then we need to learn to show humility. So we always have to be working on our racial biases. I think we know enough now about those issues to know that there's always personal biases, and building empathy for others and getting comfortable with our vulnerability around those issues is what's really important in order to move through them, especially when you're talking about working with the public and managing those issues and risks. So as we come to the end of the formal presentation, we really want to talk about taking action now to avoid a crisis later. So we want to identify your risks. Where might you be missing the mark? So is it that you have operational plans for crises, but no communications plans? Is it that you have a high risk public official that might make mistakes in speaking that might cause reputational damage that the town or the city needs to address? You need to invest in communications policies, training, and expertise. If you don't have media training and you are at risk of, fires, for example, flooding, we've seen lots of flooding in the Western Prairie provinces again. And how devastating they can be. These kinds of things happen quickly. There's no time to get media training in the midst of them, especially around things like that, or protests, for example. They happen very quickly. And then you have to learn from the communities you serve. You have to center them in the decision-making process. So if you're speaking about Black Lives Matter, you shouldn't be making decisions about what you're going to say without talking to that community and understanding the issues that they're facing. Even if you're a member of the community, you want to invest those in that learning process. You also have to listen. So you need to utilize your tools like media monitoring. So what do you do to follow social media? What do you do to monitor it? Social listening is so important, especially for municipalities, but nonprofits as well. So when you're understaffed and under capacity, over capacity, understaffed, it's challenging to be doing everything plus monitoring the social media to measure the public sentiment. But if you don't measure that, it's hard to see some of these issues coming. It's hard to see protests coming if you're not following where they're organizing and gathering. It's hard to know what your questions are going to be at your upcoming town hall if you don't know what they're talking about on social media. And it's hard to know for nonprofits what your donors care about if you're not listening to them. So it's really important to find out what your community cares about, what they're upset about, what is important to them. And then how do you communicate with them on an ongoing basis? And I completely understand how many organizations are over capacity right now, understaffed. They don't have the capacity to manage all of these different things. And that's why having a plan in place before they happen is even more important. It's taking one day of training out of your schedules to put these pieces in place. So in terms of summarizing your best practices, you want to identify your 5 to 10 top risks, and then what are your key messages for each of those scenarios. If you're always thinking about people first, how does that factor into your key messages? And then you need to know your corporate values and test your decisions against them. And for municipalities, this is the same thing. So, what are your values as an organization and as a town, and what are you going to invest in, and how do you measure your decisions against those values? And then we always want to be honest first. People are quick to forgive if you take responsibility for them right out of the gates. It's when you try to divert away from responsibility on an ongoing basis that people really challenge your transparency. And people will challenge, I find on a municipal level, people will challenge your transparency anyway. It's never transparent enough for municipalities, but on other organizations, leaning into it, taking accountability, addressing it, maybe apologizing does make a big difference. So it's something to consider for each scenario that you're drafting. And then it's really important to deliver your messages quickly and then be available to speak to them. So we see journalists don't have much of an appetite to wait longer than 15 minutes for you to call them back. So if you can imagine you're going to be called out on something, a journalist calls you and says, I'd like to interview you on this topic. If you only have 15 minutes to collect yourself, to collect your thoughts, that can be quite challenging to do, especially if it's a high stress situation. So doing some planning work in advance, especially media training, is really important. And then have multiple spokespeople to choose from. So especially in the time of COVID, if one of them gets sick and can't be on site, you need to have someone else that's trained that can speak for you. If it's you, that's the typical spokesperson. You should never rely on only one person to do that work. Always need a backup, especially if something is ongoing. Nothing, as we've seen, some of these crises don't end quickly. Be prepared to be betrayed, unfortunately, by past and current staff. The media potentially might pretend to be supportive of you, and then when they go to air, the story becomes quite aggressively against you. We see this quite frequently. And then your stakeholders as well. Like at the end of the day, stakeholders have an agenda of their own. And so you need to be prepared to be speaking to them in a way that manages the relationship. And if you don't, be prepared for them to speak out against you publicly. And then in a crisis situation, we always have a structure to document decisions or use tools that save communications as you move through them. Because as much as you think you'll never forget this incident, it's actually quite common that you forget the decisions or why you made a decision at a certain time. And especially if it becomes litigious after the fact, or if you're debriefing after the fact and you're trying to figure out what worked and what didn't, sometimes it's difficult to remember all of those just off the top of your head. So we always document our work in these situations quite closely through different tools. So we use a tool called Teamwork that collects all of that data from a project management and communications perspective. Slack is another one that collects it. There's lots of different tools out there that are quite cost effective. And then you always have to be prepared to answer very difficult questions. So we start with those difficult questions first. So if you have an issue come up, we always say to our client, what's the question you don't want to answer? And we collect those first, and then we script out the response to them. And sometimes the response is, we don't know the answer to this yet. We expect to know more tomorrow. We'll get back to you then, or we need to have an investigation first. This is the timeline of that. If you don't know the answer, typically the client will demand, or the media will demand, or community will demand that you have a process for when you will have the answers. So that comes to the end of our formal presentation. I know we've had a lot of information there. I am always happy to share my slides, or if you have a question, I'm happy to address those now. But if you do want the slides, this is my email, and I'm happy, like I said, to just share those over email. And then if you wanted to ever talk about a scenario that you might be facing, maybe not here today, if you don't want to share it publicly, but you're welcome to call me and we can talk about that further in a private setting. So are there any questions anybody would like to go through now? You've been so quiet up to this point. Anything I can address? Feel free to just unmute. You should be able to do that if I've got my settings correct. Has anybody had an experience with a crisis situation that they'd like to talk about? Those aren't always our favorite memories, for sure.
Catherine, I do have a question.
Sure. Hi,
I know we've talked in the past about like when you're doing that apologizing piece or that follow-up piece, when it comes to like nonprofits and donations, like we've had a lot of conversations around like if the person who is donating or making that donation has done something wrong, not necessarily the organization, but the donor,
right.
Then like what is that line for accepting the money or not accepting the money? And even like a lot of stuff around that. So like, for example, we have a tip tap machine that bounces around from local businesses. And one of the businesses, they weren't participating in the restriction parade, like the I can't think of the words right now. But when everyone was getting upset about the restrictions and the mandates and stuff like that, the trucker convoy, that's what I'm looking for. They weren't necessarily participating and they didn't say anything negative in the public eye, but they did support the trucker convoy. So then it was questions like, do we remove our tip tap machine from that location? So like, like we were just wondering, what's that line between like a donor doing something bad and not accepting the money versus something like this?
That is a really good question. And it almost comes down to very situation specific. So for our international folks, I know we have a few of them here. We recently had a convoy protest that had a few different arms to it. One was a group of truckers that went to Ottawa. One was a group that went to our border at Coutts of Alberta, in Alberta. And they were protesting the restrictions on face masks and vaccines and things like that. So it was quite controversial. In the Western Prairie provinces, particularly Alberta, our rural communities weren't impacted as much by COVID. And so there was more pushback on those restrictions compared to our larger cities. And so it became, as it did internationally, quite divisive, that the issue of restrictions. And so Ali, who represents a nonprofit, I can see how that would be significant. So this is, in an ideal situation, would be where you come back to your values as an organization. That one, you'd have to think about how high the risk is for you if to just keep your tip tap machine there, and to see if you had any complaints by other donors for having a presence there, and to see where your board felt how it related to the issue that you support. So if the issue that you support is, children with physical health issues, like a hospital, for example, maybe the values of your organization would say, we can no longer work with this partner because of their standing on that topic. That would be quite an aggressive stance. If it's quite quiet and the client or the donor is relatively quiet about the issue and it doesn't necessarily pertain to the organization's issues that you represent, then maybe your board would choose differently. Now, for example, we have had a post-secondary university who had a donor that said, I'm prepared to give you $3 million if you never do another land acknowledgement again. And so luckily this post-secondary was able to say, that doesn't meet our values and we're going to say no. But it's very hard for a lot of nonprofits to say no to that kind of money. But there's no way that they could publicly do that and survive the reputational risk, especially given that their programming mandates are quite focused on the Indigenous community. So it was offensive to them on many different levels. hard to say no to the money for sure, but it came down to the board decisions. And we've seen this quite a bit in the past. I remember there was lots of debates around, would you take money from big tobacco or alcohol manufacturers, which are often large donors, that have really supported nonprofits in our communities across the country and across North America, for example. And so it's hard for them. And others don't take gambling money, for example, especially anyone with a Christian background or connection often don't take money from our casinos, which in Canada, most of our casino money is, a lot of it is donated to charities in the community, especially in Alberta. So it kind of comes down to the board's value structure, the organization's value structure, what's important to them, and then what they're prepared to say no to. And it's easy for me to say from a communications perspective, of course, you're going to say no to the donor that doesn't want you to do land acknowledgements ever again. But it's hard to say no to that kind of money. So I want to acknowledge the fact that it would be very challenging to do that. It's a really good question, Ali. And I wish I had a blanket policy on how to handle that, but I do really think it's very organization specific. And it's also board specific on what they're willing to tolerate in terms of stress. Because maybe they're okay with it in that scenario. Maybe they only got 2 complaints. Maybe they got no complaints. And so they were okay with it. But if they got 100 complaints, maybe that's when they would do something about it. So it's hard to say. And sometimes you have to move through it in order to help make a decision, but it's a great question.
Thanks. You provided some great thoughts. So thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you. So I liked your comment earlier about making a list of what are some of the worst case scenarios that we could possibly deal with. But what I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, I'm wondering if you have any kind of advice or categorization, et cetera, because I mean, as many of us know, oftentimes these crises come up and there's something that happens and you're like, who would have thought,
right,
that this could have happened?
Yes.
So is there a way to, so what I'm struggling with is how to create a crisis plan for like keep it general enough to apply to whatever specific scenario. So do you have like a way of kind of guiding that? Do you create like specific categories like natural disaster, death, these kind of things? Or
yeah.
It's because like I'm with a YMCA, so we have a huge you actually worked with us, I think, a couple of years ago in Medicine Hat. So so we have obviously a wide variety of programming options, and we have 13 different physical locations and all over 200 staff. And so how do you begin to go, what are our worst case scenarios in a way that we can do enough of a plan that we can use it, but not so specific that we're creating all this work for ourselves that isn't going to be relevant if we get a 180. Does that
that is sense? A really good question. So for a nonprofit like yourself, we typically would go through what we would see, what we have seen for an organization of your size. So this one's a little bit easier because I know you guys a little bit better. So I think everybody's familiar with the YMCA being a global company. But are you in Medicine Hat, Andrea? Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so Medicine
I'm our new comms person. They've hired a Marcom person now.
Oh, so excellent.
I've been here for 6 months, so I'm still getting my feet in.
Of course you are.
Yeah,
that's great. So Medicine Hat is a smaller community in Alberta. And so YMCA is very similar, but you do a lot of social programs as well as the gym and pool, swimming lessons, those kinds of things. So childcare. Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And child protection is a huge thing for the Y as well.
Huge issue. So when we look at your risk points, you probably would have more. And so it is a lot of work, but I would encourage you to plug away at it. So I would be looking at things like financial management. So a data breach, financial mismanagement, a loss of a funder that is a significant, if you get 20% of your funding from one group or one government wing or one individual, that would be a high risk scenario that you would want to have some structure to. In terms of the clients you serve, you would want to look at an accidental drowning or death on site. You would want to look at an employee acting inappropriately or hurting one of the children in some way, or hurting an individual in some way. You would probably also want to look at something like a protest that interrupted operations. So say, for example, well, if you decided to raise childcare rates up 20%,
and there I hope I'm not walking here if we ever do that.
Right. And there was a protest as a result. Mm-hmm. And the protest might be on social media, right? It might not be physical, but we see a lot of physical protests that interrupt operations. You would want to look at holding statements for each of those, plus press releases, plus statements from board members. And then you'd also want to look at, an active shooter type of situation, which is less common, I think, in Canada, but I don't think we're seeing it grow. So I think, you kind of prioritize what you think the higher risk ones are and work through it. And it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be fancy, but it has to be, these are our stakeholder groups. This is who needs to be spoken to first. This is how to contact them. These are our media contacts. These are our holding statements. This is how we get a message out to the community quickly. And even for example, we see some of the holdups are, we'll write a press release and we'll need board approval, and we can't get a quorum on the approval because we can't locate all of the board members needed for a quorum. And it shouldn't always have to have a quorum, but sometimes that's the way that they operate. And so that's what holds us up. And then all of a sudden the organization has reputational damage for not responding in the middle of a crisis instantly. And so we don't want that, right? Mm-hmm. So it is a lot of work. I'm not going to blow sunshine on that one. It is a lot of work, but in the event it happens, you'll be grateful you have it, because you have a checklist, and then you have a messaging structure that the board is already in an ideal situation familiar with, and they've had some media training. And then us, so you can always give us a call too.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions I can maybe address? Okay, well, Megan.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. What organization are you with?
Canadian Mental Health Association, Calgary.
Oh, great. Yeah. I know you guys.
Awesome. I'm new, so I'm new to the team here. But thank you for all this. This is great. Just a thought to share and then a question. I think one of the things I've found most helpful in those immediate moments is to have a kind of standing statements that that they're already pre-approved that you can just issue. I don't know if that's something that you've worked with before, or you would recommend developing those.
Yeah, I absolutely do. We actually on our team collect all kinds of statements. So we're always watching the media, and we see what happens to other companies out there, and we collect their statements, and then we debrief. Well, what did they do right? What did they do wrong? We collect apologies all the time. I'm one of those weirdos that has a big folder of other people's apologies, because we like to debrief them and see what plays well, what doesn't play well, and go through them, and we measure the sentiment around them. So I think it's a great idea. And especially for an organization like yours, I know you guys a little bit. And so I do know you're contacted every time something happens in the media that is connected to mental health. So some kind of terrible tragedy happens and there's a mental health consequence or a trigger. And so the media doesn't know who to call. So they think, who do I call? I'll call Canadian Mental Health Association, and they get the Calgary chapter and they'll say, can you please respond to this incident? So we had an incident in Calgary a couple of months ago where a new Canadian had a mental health issue and unfortunately died in a conflict with the police when the police responded. And so it's a bigger issue around mental health that needed to happen. It's a bigger issue around how the police are handling mental health situations, but they come to you to ask for your response on an issue that you've got nothing to do with, other than you support people with mental health issues in a variety of different ways. And so you would be a perfect candidate for having a number of those boilerplate type statements that you can fire off. Because I know you a little, I know your organization well enough to know you guys typically will pass on those kinds of comments. And so that would be one of those cases where it would be really important. The only thing I would advise you against is if something happened where you were responsible, or the visual was that you were responsible for it, you would want to be really cautious about sending out something templated that looked templated. You would want to look like you were more directly invested in the conversation. So that would be the only thing I would pass. But I think for you guys, I think that's a great idea.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And then my question is, when you're getting into some of these, and I've had my share of a few of them, something that I think about often much later, and I'd love your thoughts on kind of when you're just at the early stages of a crisis, how do you lay out kind of your goals as an organization, as an executive? Sometimes I find that people are really on different pages when it comes to what are we trying to achieve here. And I know you mentioned, the people most impacted first and those victims first, of course. But beyond that, how do you kind of get everybody on the same page, singing from the same song sheet?
That is a really good question. And I know you're looking at that from a nonprofit lens. The lens I think about is my municipal lens on this one. So for example, we have a really controversial flood mitigation project in a small town in Alberta. So a good portion of the town doesn't believe in climate change. And so as a result, they don't feel like they're at a huge flood risk. Even though we've been saying, and scientists have been saying, and the Alberta government has been saying, you're at risk as a result of climate change. So our municipal, the town administration, for example, their goal is to use the funding available to protect the town so that people can get mortgages and insurance in these areas of flood risk. The mayor and council, for example, they would be thinking about, they have to live and work in this community on an ongoing basis. So they need to engage with the public, and under the Municipal Government Act, they are obligated to engage with the public, get feedback and respond. And so the administration has a job to do that worries less about individuals' feelings on the topic. They're still definitely compelled to engage with the public and respond to the public, but they have a job to do to protect the majority of people who are in favor of the project. But typically the people who are in favor are the quiet ones. It's not the people who say, yes, let's do it, that are the vocal ones. Whereas mayor and council, who are elected officials, they're needing to keep public sentiment positive towards them. And so the goals are different between those different stakeholder groups. My goal as a communications professional is to disseminate information, engage in conversations that are productive. So we all have different goals. I think the only thing I can say to you around that is to figure out what your goals are before you get to a crisis situation, because the last thing you want is to be at the height of a crisis situation saying, what are our goals here? And it's complicated. We had people with the best of intentions and really good people have inadvertently got themselves into deep water on something like this. So we represent an association of medical professionals that what they do, it's an Alberta focused, a provincially focused association, and they negotiate payment for that service, and they negotiate insurance for that service. And so for them, they decided to do a blanket statement around diversity and inclusivity that they felt as their values matched. And so they did this wide reaching, very broad statement of inclusivity that was supposed to encompass everyone in the province. And in the province of Alberta, for any of you folks that aren't familiar with Alberta, we have a very diverse community, and the rural community is quite different than the communities in the city. And so because these were medical professionals, and we have very few medical professionals, especially in our rural communities, in some of our rural communities, there's a religious component to the members of those communities. And so when we ask someone with a Christian, that's Christian and sometimes quite devoutly Christian, to support someone who's a trans woman going through a birthing process, when we ask them to respect and include everyone with those diverse backgrounds, sometimes there's inherent conflict. And so the organization, their goal was to be more inclusive and to engage with more diverse communities in a way that respected them. But they did not set up a process for managing conflict once that statement was in place. And it wasn't what they were built to do. And so their intentions were good, and their goals were about increasing inclusivity, but what they really did was create a conflict that they didn't have the training to navigate through. And so sometimes it's really important for a group to take a step back and say, whoa, we've made a mistake here. We need to bring in someone who is an expert on this topic, and in particular anti-oppression work, to navigate through the next steps and to define the goals. But you still have to communicate through that navigation to the community that's been harmed. So the goals evolved on that one. And it was a really good learning for us, because those blanket inclusivity statements can be just as risky as not having them. And in a community like Alberta, where we're trying to be supportive of diversity, sometimes that's really challenging. We saw this in our homeless population as well, where we had families coming in from other countries where, for example, polygamy was accepted and legal, and then they come into Canada and they come into our homeless shelter, and then all of a sudden that's not legal or appropriate here, but we have a family structure that we're supporting through homelessness, or being unhoused, depending on how you use language in that community, in your area. And navigating through that can be quite challenging and results in some issues. So really good question. I think it creates more conversation than anything else. Yeah. Thanks, Megan.
Sure. Thank you so much.
I know we're at 2:01 right now. Are there any other questions that I can answer? Well, thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Like I said, I'm always happy to talk about this kind of work. I'm always happy to share my slides. Any of the new comms people, Andrea, if you ever want to talk about communications, you reach out anytime. But thank you all for coming, and I encourage you to look at our other workshops. We always enjoy having you. So thanks everybody, and take care. We'll speak soon.